I'm delighted to welcome everyone here to Leonard Auditorium tonight. And I need to start off by introducing the foundation of this event, Dr. George Tyson.
Thank you, Peter. On behalf of the Tyson family, my wife Ann, my son Adam and his wife Liz, my daughter Julia and her fiance John White, both of them Wofford grads, and those in the family who couldn't be here tonight, we welcome you to this 6th annual Tyson Family Lectureship on the preservation and restoration of the southern ecosystem. I'd like to welcome some special guests. Wofford's Provost, Mike Sosulski. It's a pleasure to have you here, and this validates the importance of this event in the college life. We appreciate very much your being here. I'd like to welcome Amy Telligman, the newest faculty member in the environmental studies. We've heard nothing but wonderful things about you from the students and the faculty, and I hope your tenure here at Wofford is long and very, very productive. Drew Lantham, a very wonderful surprise to see you here tonight. Drew was our lecturer last year and gave us a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and it's a wonderful pleasure and a surprise to see you here tonight. Rhett Johnson, former professor of forestry at Auburn, the founder of the Longleaf Alliance, and our first lecturer 6 years ago. And outside of Shelby Foote, has the most wonderful Southern accent in the history of the world. A very special guest for me, one of my dearest friends from my student days at Wofford, George Korn, and outside of my wife and children, probably influenced me more in my attitude toward the environment than anyone else. George Korn and I spent numerous, some might say wasted numerous hours rambling around the southern Appalachians. At the time, someone might have said we should have spent it more productively, but in retrospect, I think we spent it very productively. For the students here, you need to understand George was something of a radical, and almost single-handedly, it is due to George that there are no Saturday classes or mandatory chapel. Let me say this again. Saturday classes and mandatory chapel, the horror. So thank George when this is over. I do want to make a serious point. Tonight's event, while the Tyson Lectureship, is the prototype for what in years to come will be the John Lane Dialogue. Unfortunately for us, John at some point in the next several years will retire. And he tried to stop anything from being done to honor him. But I told him to get over it. And after much lengthy discussion, he agreed that what we would do in alternate years with the Tyson Lectureship, there will be a John Lane Dialogue in which nationally renowned scholars will come to campus. Each time there will be one from the humanities, and in alternating fashion, there will be a hard scientist on one occasion, and alternating with that, there will be a soft scientist, a social scientist, perhaps. And as tonight, both will come to campus, spend several days, attend classes, seminars, and then in the ultimate event, appear on stage together and conduct a dialogue, just as we'll see tonight. So, particularly for the Wofford faculty, if you have suggestions as to how we can make this better, suggestions for how we might conduct it, please talk to Peter or me. And we want to make this a nationally recognized event. We want to attract nationally and internationally renowned scholars. We want to really put this on the map And I think by doing it in alternate years, we will have the resources to do this. And let me say frankly that if any of you would like to contribute to the endowment necessary to fund this, please talk to me or see David Wood. We would welcome that. For the first time this year, we are filming this event so that it can be used as a teaching tool in schools and whatever. So I look forward to that in the future as well, and I only regret that some of the past events are not archived. As those on campus in the last day or so have heard, and we will hear tonight, the Coyote story, particularly in the Southeast, is really just beginning. So many times when I read natural history, there's a period at the end of it. It's over. It's a complete story. And this is so fascinating because we are living in the middle of it. And we are so fortunate to have these two individuals to chronicle it for us as it's happening. And so what a spectacular evening we're in store for. Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you too. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, George. And so with that, we're going to get going with tonight's controversial canine conversation between Dan Flores, the author of Coyote America, and our own John Lane, the author of Coyote Settles the South. And I had envisioned having this with the two of you sitting here now, so why don't you all come up? The plan for the evening, while they're getting settled, goes something like this. Dan and John will talk for about 40 minutes. And then we will open it up for a question and answer session from the audience. If you have any questions of any kind, be very free to come and ask them, but make sure to use the microphones right here. Our audiovisual folks have been adamant on that point. So we're here to think and talk about coyotes. And as you listen and take part, one of the things that I want to impress upon you is that this is not just an American animal, not just an animal of the New South. This is a Wofford animal. They are right here. We share this campus with coyotes. There are coyotes within a short walk of where we sit now. There might even be one in the audience. Coyotes are the original American dog. So when Europeans came to this continent, they brought with them, we brought with us, a long cultural history with wolves and hounds and foxes, but didn't quite know what to do with this new canine that we met on the prairies and the deserts. Over time, we learned to hate them, and we learned to love coyotes. And I think that coyotes probably feel about the same way about us. I just recently learned from reading Dan's book about how massive the effort has been to kill coyotes, and in fact only today heard about a student who says that they shot, along with their family, 58 coyotes in one field. But at the same time, the coyotes have been unfazed and have been moving, surging into the industrialized, densely populated eastern habitat that we've made for ourselves, and found that it suited them pretty well. So just about every other mammalian predator you can think of is a rare sighting. You don't see too many bears or wolves or mountain lions, but coyotes have become an animal that you can know, an animal that you experience personally. I remember in my own life getting up and heading to work and watching coyotes catching mice in the fields. Coming home from work and seeing them stare warily at me from beside a baseball diamond, going to sleep at night to the sounds of their howls. And it's the coyote chorus that starts John Lane's book. John takes us through the experience that we all in the Southeast are having and will continue to have. As a region that tells stories about the land and about the past, we find ourselves now having to make new stories about an animal whose time in the South is all future. And John guides us through what it means to have coyotes on this landscape. I think the coyote phenomenon, and it is a phenomenon for good, bad, and otherwise, has an analogy with our own arrival here. That as Europeans made their way across the Atlantic Ocean to impose themselves on the landscape and the ecosystem and the people they found here, we made ourselves at home and spread across the continent, and now we find coyotes doing this to us. And we live in, we find, Dan Flores' Coyote America. The three experiences that I mentioned a moment ago, coyotes in the morning, coyotes in the afternoon, coyotes at night, those are from three different lives in three different states where I lived, each of them 1,000 miles apart. It is a nation dominated by coyotes. And Dan explores all the history, the science, the mythology behind the coyote phenomenon and our developing role in it. Now, these two books are both a fantastic introduction to this animal that has slunk into all of our lives. I would be remiss to not mention that both books are on sale in the lobby, and that John and Dan would be glad to meet with you, perhaps sign a book if you'd like afterwards. And so, without too much further ado, I'll turn it over to Dan and John by asking a question that I had in my mind throughout the time that I spent reading these, which is, so do you like coyotes?
Dan, I think we got to have a dialogue now. I'm gonna defer to you as the visitor from far out west. Do you like coyotes?
Absolutely, I like coyotes. So let me ask you before I go on, are you able to hear okay? All right, good. And I also want to thank George Tyson for that lovely introduction tonight, and also for underwriting this whole project to make this possible. So thank you very much for the Tyson family and its lecture. Do I like coyotes? You know, I absolutely love coyotes. And I kind of created a meme in the book for people who also love coyotes. I was telling, I will say that John and I have been talking about coyotes at 7:30 this morning and have done so literally all day long. I think I've probably signed at least 200 or 300 books for people who have asked me to inscribe their books "Another Coyote Lover," which means that means something special to me, because it means there are a lot of people around the country who are not completely shocked out of their wits at the fact that we have suddenly in our midst a small wolf trotting through our yards and trotting down the streets in our suburbs, or rummaging around in the alleys of our big cities. This is a new thing for many Americans. It's not necessarily a new thing for people in the American West. We've been living with coyotes forever. They were on the landscape when the West was settled. Los Angeles has had coyotes from the founding of the city right through to the present. But even Angelenos sometimes struggle with the fact that there are coyotes there. And I think one of the reasons is because a lot of people who are in Los Angeles are from other parts of the country, other parts of the world. They're encountering coyotes for the first time too, and not exactly knowing what to make of them. I mean, we settled in cities 5,000 years ago in part to escape predators, and suddenly here we are living in towns and cities all over the country, and there are predators in our midst once again. One New Yorker who I quote in the book said when coyotes began to colonize the boroughs of New York City, well, that's the end of civilization as we know it. I think what it actually is the beginning of a new civilization where we actually get to have the wild in our midst. We don't have to go to Yellowstone National Park or to Alaska to see wolves anymore. We get to see them in our neighborhoods. And so my response is absolutely I love coyotes. and I'm a defender of them, but I am willing to admit that they cause problems for some people. And one of the tasks of thinking about coyotes being all across America is to figure out how we coexist with them, what we have to do to make this work. The coyotes already know how to make it work. We're the ones who have to figure out how to take the next step.
Yeah. I want to thank George as well. This lecture series has been very important for me, very important for our department, and I think very important for the life of the college. And I really want to thank him and his family for the resources that they have focused on us. So when I was working on trying to figure out what to call my book, titles are very important to me because I'm an English professor and I know that a title is a big fat finger pointing at the theme of a book, Moby Dick. So when I was working on this book, from the very beginning, I had this title in my head, Coyote Settles the South. I could have replaced settles with a number of words that would have made coyote haters or coyote skeptics happier than the word I chose. Once again, coyote settles the South. I think it says exactly how I feel about coyotes. I could have said, coyote invades the South. I could have said, coyote colonizes the South. I could have said, coyote, and this was actually a suggestion by an editor, and I decided, coyote unsettles the South. But instead, I wanted that ambiguity of that word, but also that sense of these animals are here to stay. They're here, they're not going away, and we've got to learn to coexist with them. So I wanted that sense of settlement in the same way that this animal, Homo sapien sapien, came from Europe, settled South Carolina, and I'm still here. I saw the coyotes as being very similar to that. I didn't see them as invasive, although they did come from another part of the country, but as we pointed out all day, we know they were here 15,000 years ago because there's fossil records in a few states north of us and in Florida. There was a coyote-like animal in the southeast in the Pleistocene. They went away for a while. Dan pointed out beautifully today, the horse is in a similar situation. We can't say the horse is an invasive species, I don't think, and Dan doesn't think, because it was here, it evolved here, and then it came back with the Spaniards. So I would say that my title points to how I feel about coyotes, and also if you read my book carefully, you'll see that even though I know the issue is complicated, and I tried to get as many voices in the book as I could, I talked to hunters, I talked to trappers, and I wanted to point out 3 of the characters in my book are in the audience tonight. There's the Great Gatsby. There's no, I'm kidding. There's Drew Lanham and Rhett Johnson and Mike Willis are all characters in my book, and I hope that I was fair to them in my depictions of them. And I tried to show an entire spectrum of views on coyotes, all the way from the coyote hater to the coyote hugger. I have an actual coyote hugger in my book who hugs coyotes. But I think that by my narratives and my language, I very clearly point to my love of coyotes and my appreciation for them in the landscape. So Dan, I wanted to ask you, I finished your book for a second time this morning, going back through, just kind of coming up with some things I wanted to talk with you about. And one thing that really struck me was how similar our books are, even though you're an environmental historian from the West and I'm a poet writer from the South. But we both ended up in the same place. We both ended up talking about coyote coexistence. And I think you do a better job with it than I do, so I'm going to just ask you about that. What is it about this coyote coexistence, and what does that mean, that term?
Yeah, it's a great term for one thing, and we probably need to coexist with a lot more animals than just coyotes. But it's become an issue, obviously, all across America as a result of the fairly recent migration. I call it Coyote Manifest Destiny. We think of Manifest Destiny, of course, as the story of Europeans making their way across the continent from east to west. This is a canid making its way across the continent, going in the opposite direction. And I think it's something that, as I said, we're having to grapple with sort of new. And as George mentioned in his introductory remarks, I mean, this is, if you think about it, this is really a remarkable moment in time for us and for the coyotes as well, because it's not a moment that's going to come again. Their arrival in places they haven't been in for 15,000 years is a brand new thing under the sun. My grandparents in Louisiana, where I grew up, didn't get to experience coyotes on the landscape. But when I was a kid, 12, 13, 14 years old, I suddenly discovered that these animals were coming out of the west and were in the bayous, swamps, and the Red River Valley in particular, because they love open terrain, of my home landscape. I mean, I write a couple of times in the book stories about how, as a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old, I reacted to seeing these animals that, I mean, I grew up thinking that a coyote is an animal of the western deserts. It was a little bit, seeing the first one was a little bit like rounding a corner in New Orleans and confronting a moose or something. It was absolutely counterintuitive to everything that I thought I knew about nature in the South. But I also have realized over the years, thinking back on it, that I was really in a kind of a remarkable and wonderful situation to get to see this happen. And no one in my family before me or after me has really gotten to experience that phenomenon of suddenly here these animals are from a great distance at what I thought was a great distance away. So I think in terms of where we both end our books with coexistence, what that means, first of all, is that frankly, folks, we don't actually have an option, because we are not going to make them go away. I mean, this is a hard thing for Americans to swallow, because we're used to, when we don't like something in the natural world, we can invent a poison, invent a pesticide, come up with some management technique, and poof, all the mosquitoes are gone. We've got DDT now, and we don't have to worry about being devoured by mosquitoes in the summertime. But with coyotes, as I spend a good bit of space on in Coyote America, we have been trying to exterminate those animals in the American West for the last 75 years. And between 1931, when Congress actually passed a law that provided a government agency called the Biological Survey $1 million a year for 10 years to eradicate coyotes, we started in 1931, and until 1972, when Richard Nixon, by presidential proclamation, finally forbade the use of poisons on the public lands in the West to kill coyotes, we spent more than $55 million and probably killed upwards of 15 million animals. And the only result of that was to spread coyotes out of the West across the entire North American continent. So that we end up, after all that effort and all that money, with more coyotes now than we've ever had in North American history, and spread across a broader landscape.
What's that line of yours that I love so much from the first chapter?
Well, I think you're referring to the one where I say something like, doing the same thing over and over and over again without any kind of positive result to show for it is not an act of intelligence, it's an act of ideology. It's the Sisyphus story of pushing the ball up the hill and having it roll back down on you, and doing it again and again and again and again, and for some reason never stopping. Because it became obvious to biologists by the 1950s that this was a losing proposition. Coyotes could take every haymaker we could throw at them, every poison we could invent. And by the way, we had a national laboratory called the Eradication Methods Laboratory that was designed to invent poisons to exterminate coyotes. And as I said, the result was what we have now, coyotes spread across the continent. So the first step in understanding that you have to coexist with them is to wrap your mind around the fact that we're not going to be able to make them go away. I mean, we can, with Herculean efforts, momentarily suppress their populations, but what that usually does, what it's done over and over and over in the West, is to skew their social dynamics so that what you end up with are younger, more inexperienced animals that tend to get in more trouble, both for themselves and trouble with us, than if you leave their populations alone. So that's kind of the first step. The second step, I think, and I mean, I know you've got some ideas about this because you write about them, but I think the second step is to accommodate ourselves to the fact that, okay, we not only are going to have coyotes in our midst, we have the great opportunity to have coyotes in our midst. It's like, and I think I use this terminology somewhere in the book, it's like getting the opportunity to look through a telescope and see the Galilean moons of Jupiter on a summer evening, or watch whales breach in the ocean. It's one of those miracles of nature that you actually get to have, yet we're getting to have it in our yards and on our streets and not having to go to Yellowstone or Alaska, as I mentioned, in order to experience this. And so it's something we ought to embrace, we kind of need to embrace it, as a positive effect in our lives. And then the third thing you have to do to coexist with coyotes is we have to modify our behavior. I mean, we can't turn our cats loose at night or in the morning to go hunt songbirds. You have to keep your small pets up and be careful about them. And you have to make sure when you encounter coyotes that we keep them wild and a little bit nervous about them. We have to make sure that, as I think I said earlier today, that they think we're a little bit too weird to trust because they spent 15,000 years living among human beings in North America without being harassed at all. We've only been harassing them for about 125 years now, and that's not been long enough to really make them very afraid of us. And so they very quickly kind of become habituated to being around us. And so the thing you have to do really is to keep them a little bit nervous. Keep them wild animals, in other words. Don't feed them in the yard. And if they stand and don't run away from you, throw a rock at them or shout at them or something. But keep them wild. And then, because resistance is futile, learn how to enjoy their presence.
Yeah,
So what are your thoughts on this?
I think I came to coexistence a little differently in that I had one night, we were sitting on the deck, my wife and I, and we heard coyotes for the first time. And it was a powerful experience for me. I've talked to so many people since the book was written who come up to me and go, you know, I had the same experience. I was on my deck, I heard coyotes, and it scared the crap out of me. I just went into a direct fear state the second I heard them. And there are probably people here in the audience that feel that way. And for whatever reason, I was set up to not fear them when I heard them, but to feel like in some way that sound was a wilding of the floodplain behind our house that I'd been waiting for. That there was a silence to that floodplain with the absence of this predator, this large predator that I'd been waiting for. I knew there were bobcats in the floodplain. Betsy saw one once. I knew there were foxes. I've seen red and gray foxes in the floodplain. I knew we had big copperheads because I caught one and gave it to Chuck Smith to keep in his lab. But there weren't any big animals moving through. There was a rumor of a bear. Somebody saw down the creek some scat, and we think there was a bear roving through. But when I heard those coyotes, it opened up the world for me, and it filled in the world for me in a way that I wanted as a writer and as a naturalist. I was aware enough of animals and landscapes that even though we have a fat beagle, and he's a star of this book too, not as big a star as Mike Willis, but he's in the book. And
Murphy's his name.
Murphy the short-legged beagle. We think he actually may have a problem, but he's got very short legs. I knew that if Murphy gets eaten by a coyote, and he can because our fence is only 4 feet tall, and if he gets eaten by a coyote, I will mourn his loss. But I will say it's my fault. I should have kept a closer eye on him. I should have built a higher fence if I was concerned. It's not the coyote's fault because the coyote knows exactly what it's doing out there. It's working out there like a special ops team. It's smarter than Murphy. It's probably smarter than I am, and it's working in the landscape as it should be. If it kills Murphy, if it eats Murphy, and I feel like that. I expect that sort of awareness to ripple out if we're going to learn to coexist with these animals, that we've all got to become conscious of our cats and our small dogs and our livestock. There's no excuse in my mind if somebody loses a calf and they had a chance to buy a guard animal and they didn't. And I mean, that we've got to learn certain habits of mind to live with these animals in the landscape. And most of us haven't done it yet. We do it with our children. Nobody lets our children play in the street today. Everybody thinks about, we want our children to survive childhood, so keep them out of the street. But we don't think that way with our pets. You had an interesting, so that's one way I went toward coexistence is this idea that there are certain things, if we're going to coexist, that I have to learn as a person about animals and landscape. One thing that fascinated me, Dan, in your book that I never thought about, Dan makes a point in his book that one of the reasons that coyotes flourished in the cities was because of leash laws. It never occurred to me that in the old days, coyotes wouldn't go into the cities because there were crazy dogs running everywhere. There were wild, loose dogs everywhere. Nobody had their dog in an electric fence or on a leash. They ran free. They were hit by cars. They'd go from yard to yard. And the coyotes on the edge of those western cities knew this, and they weren't going near those dogs. So the minute that we had these leash laws and yard dogs, we opened up all these avenues for coyotes to inhabit our cities. I never thought about that. That was a really great. When did that come to you?
Well,
and how did that come to you?
Yeah, it's an intriguing idea. And I had a PhD student at the University of Montana, John Hall is his name, who was working on what he called the Great Dog War in the 19th century. And what he was writing about for a PhD dissertation was this transition time from when in American cities we just let dogs run loose everywhere. And so there were dogs that were sort of loosely owned by people but roamed widely through the city. And then there were also essentially feral dogs in cities. And starting with a rabies outbreak among those dogs in Boston in 1848, Boston sort of took the lead in coming up with what we now call dog catchers and pounds and ultimately leash laws, so that you couldn't just let dogs run wild through cityscapes. And Boston became the city that in effect kind of created the iconic strategy for this, and one city after another across the United States adopted that. Between about 1850 and about 1910, literally all American cities followed the lead of Boston in coming up with dog catchers and dog pounds. And I mean, they did pretty draconian things. One city, I won't name which one it was, built a gigantic wet pool, and every dog they caught loose in the city, they just tossed into this pool and drowned. Oh. I mean, they drowned hundreds of dogs every week for 3 or 4 years in order to remove what they thought of as a scourge of city life. What that meant for coyotes, which have always been urban animals, by the way. I mean, they lived in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital of Mexico, 1,000 years ago. And out in the southwest where I live, near Santa Fe, New Mexico, the biggest city that was in North America until finally New York, Philadelphia, and Boston surpassed it in size, was a place that's now known as Chaco Monument National, or Chaco Preservation National Park. And that area was basically, it was kind of a southwestern Vatican. It was a city where there was a religious population, and about 4 times a year at the solstices and equinoxes, a population that probably went over 125 to 150,000 people congregated there for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And we know from the archaeology done in Chaco Canyon that there were coyotes in that city while 150,000 people were there. So they've been living among us for thousands of years, and once we, in modern American cities, we adopted this sort of dog strategy in order to eliminate feral dogs from cities, they moved into our cities, where they are, by the way, doing extremely well these days. Los Angeles has a population of about 5,000 coyotes in the city limits. Chicago is believed to have a population of more than 4,000. One of the biologists who works there says that everybody in Chicago, when they go to sleep at night, there's a coyote within a half mile of them. And of course, New York City is their newest frontier. And they are, all sorts of wonderful stories are coming out of the boroughs of New York City. Like the coyote, it's now been 2 years ago, who was on the rooftop of a bar in Queens when a bunch of patrons emerged about 8 o'clock at night on a spring evening and looked up, heard a disturbance and looked up, and here's a coyote looking down at them from the top of the bar. Traffic is going by, people are going by on the streets, and here's a coyote just sort of studying the scene. And of course, they do what we humans tend to do when we see coyotes and we're not familiar with them. They immediately call 911. And within about 5 minutes, a truck rounded the corner. The coyote took one look at it, turned, found a broken window in a building next door, hopped through it, and disappeared and was never seen again. But sort of like a Hollywood action hero, you know. But, I mean, they're doing extremely well in every kind of setting in America. And it's a statement about their resilience and their cosmopolitanism. They kind of do the same sort of things that we do. And that's one of the reasons they seem to like living among us. They see us as kin, I think.
I think so, yeah. Yeah, one of the most fascinating things that I discovered and read about was this connection that we tend to think, one of my favorite films to teach is a film by Werner Herzog called Grizzly Man. And it's a crazy film about a guy goes to Alaska, lives with grizzly bears for 12 years, and then gets eaten by grizzly bears after 12 years. And Herzog takes footage that he created and then makes a film with his narration over it. And if you know anything about the German filmmaker Werner Herzog, he's got this great accent. And so at the end of this film, he has a picture of the grizzly bear, close-up, that Timothy Treadwell took of the grizzly bear's face. And he says, I'm going to do a bad Werner Herzog here, the face of the grizzly bear shows nothing but the benign indifference of the universe. There is no hidden world of the grizzly bear. There is no secret world of bears. The bear is nothing but hunger. That's all that's in the bear's face is hunger. And every time I teach that in 202, I kind of go off on Werner Herzog and how wrong he is. Because I'm looking at the same face and I see different things. I mean, I understand why he sees it the way he is. He does, but with coyotes, the thing that really fascinated me was when I started reading these accounts of how they are as interested in us as we are as interested in them. That they, when they are looking at us, they're fascinated with what we're doing. They play. There's all kinds of accounts. I heard one just the other day of things being left in the yard and coming out the next day, and our game cameras, well, they'll catch coyotes doing exactly what our dogs would do, you know, picking something up, throwing it up in the air, playing with it, all this stuff. But there's that connection that we don't want to give to the animal, because if we give those connections to the animal, it's a lot harder to kill the animal and to eradicate the animal. Because the minute we make them other, we can kill them. When I was in Alabama, when I went down with Mike Willis to do my Alabama chapter, I was in a diner down there, and this guy came up who knew my host, he came up and he said, "Writing a book about coyotes, huh?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'd only read that book if you've got a bunch of new ways I could kill them in there." And then he walks away. You know, that was his interaction with the species, had no sense of we being a species among species, and this being an animal that somehow might engage us in the same way that we engage it.
So, I mean, listening to you reminds me of a story that, I mean, maybe you folks would enjoy hearing this. It's from the decade right after the Animal Damage Control Act of 1931 was passed in Congress to provide for the extermination of coyotes. And we had just managed to basically wipe out wolves. By the 1920s, wolves were even gone from Yellowstone National Park. And so the Biological Survey, this agency that was going to resolve the predator problem in America, because they argued to the public, and by the way, a lot of our hatred of coyotes and wolves comes from the propaganda campaign that the Biological Survey conducted in the 30s and 40s, trying to convince people that these predators didn't belong in a civilized America. But in this decade after the passage of that act, even though we had designated coyotes as the arch predator of our time, they had replaced wolves now as the arch predator, and we were going to exterminate them, we still hadn't done any science on them at all. I mean, not a single biologist had gone out and conducted enough science to even know what coyotes ate. And so two brothers ended up being hired by the Park Service and by the Biological Survey to go out and do the first studies, one in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the other one in Yellowstone National Park, to demonstrate that the coyote was the arch predator of our time. And what they were referring to at that moment was the arch predator of game animals. The coyote was going to be a threat to pronghorns and bighorn sheep and mule deer, white-tailed deer, elk even. One of these brothers, his name was Adolf, and their last name was Murray. Olaus Murray and Adolf Murray. Adolf Murray got the task of doing the study in Yellowstone National Park. And I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times this summer and led with this story because I thought this kind of captures what John was just saying about seeing these animals beyond something than just our stereotype of them, however poorly it was drawn with very little knowledge behind it. Because Adolf Murray was in Yellowstone about a year and a half into his study, and he was standing by a game trail one morning, and he saw a coyote trotting along this game trail towards him, and he saw it like 125 yards away, and he could tell as he watched it approach, it was doing something kind of bizarre. He saw its head going up at intervals, and as it got closer to him, he realized this coyote had a sprig of sagebrush in its mouth that it was periodically tossing into the air and then adroitly catching, trotting a few feet more along the game trail, tossing the sprig of sagebrush up in the air again and catching it again. And it trotted right by Murray, who stood there motionless watching this animal playing with this sprig of sagebrush. And the conclusion he drew from it was that he was getting to witness not the arch predator of America, but he was getting to witness an animal that was in love with being alive. And as he thought about that, he thought, I'm not sure I want to work for a government agency that is trying to spread hatred for an animal that is in love with life. And he ended up, as his brother did, finally resigning their posts The brother, Olafsmjöri, became one of the first directors of the Wilderness Society. And Adolf went on to study the wolves of Mount McKinley and write a very famous book about the wolves of Mount McKinley. But it was one of those moments in time where all the preconceptions and all the preloaded stereotypes fell away from someone's mind, and they confronted the animal, animal to animal, and just saw it for what it was. And what he saw in that moment was an animal that was in love with life. I've really been moved by that story ever since I found it, and I found it just by sitting down and reading his report from 1938, a study of coyotes in Yellowstone National Park, because I thought it's an example of the kind of experience that we really all need to have with them, not bring these preloaded conceptions that have been put in our head sometimes by a government agency that was intent on eradicating these animals, and trying to see them for what they really are.
Yeah, but we need to be clear. We've talked about this all day. Even though we may sound like, I don't know if this went off or not. Can you still hear me? Yeah, we may sound like sort of coyote-loving hippies, that soft-hearted coyote-loving hippies. But I mean, I think both of us would say that we understand that if you're a hunter and coyotes are killing 70% of the fawns born in your area in a year, and your deer population is dropping, and what you want to do is shoot deer, you may have a different understanding of this. Or if you're a suburbanite and you're a little scatterbrained and you let your dog out in the backyard or your cat out and you just cannot control that, and it's eaten by a coyote, you may have a different understanding of this or feeling about this, Or if you're if you believe that you need to control areas, that control is important. You may have a different understanding. But I think what both of us tried to show in our books was that these issues are all complex and multifaceted, and different voices, different ideas come to bear on this question of an animal in a landscape.
So John's book, as you all know, is about coyotes settling the South, which is a story of basically about the last 25 or 30 years, or going back to my part of the South, Louisiana. This began in the late 1950s, so it goes back nearly 75 years. But one of the things that I sincerely believe might help all of us who are trying to wrap our minds around having coyotes in our midst these days is simply knowing something about their biography. Because this animal, unlike many of the animals we tend to even think of as native to North America, this animal actually, its evolutionary roots are here, and they go back 5.3 million years. Coyotes don't emerge as a progenitor of our modern species until probably about 1 million years ago, or maybe 800,000 years ago. But the canid family goes back in North America, and it evolved in North America more than 5 million years ago. So these animals have been here forever. We've at the most been here for only 500 years. My family in Louisiana has been in North America for 302 years, which seems like a long time, except that doesn't hold a candle to 800,000 years of the species Canis latrans as a native of North America. It's been singing that coyote song as the original national anthem of North America for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it's an animal that not only is part of the evolutionary legacy of the continent that we live on, but it's also an animal that has 15,000 years at least of close interaction with human beings. For about 14,900 of those years, it was a sacred animal for people in North America. Not persecuted, not harassed, not chased, not killed because it might be taking fawns, but regarded as a sacred animal that really kind of functioned in the oldest literature in North America as a stand-in for human beings. The term I use in the book a lot is an avatar for human beings. And what I'm referring to, most of you are probably already there, is the old man coyote stories from Western North America, which it's the oldest literature from our continent. So this is a very, very old biography of this animal. It seems new to people in the Southeast, in the Northeast, in the Midwest, but it's not new by any means. And it knows how to live among us because it's been doing it for a long time. So anyway, I'm just tossing that out as a way to kind of stretch your consciousness a little bit, I hope, about this animal that seems so startling to so many people these days. I mean, like John said, we both are very familiar with the reaction that people have that, you know, this animal is just screwing up everything about modern life.
Yeah.
And I got to call somebody to come do something because this thing is driving me out of my mind. I mean, that's sort of what happened to Captain Ahab in Moby Dick, as I recall.
Yeah.
He went out of his mind because he couldn't control nature. And so regard that as an instructive lesson. We're not going to be able to control these animals except in a very, very minor key.
So I went through the process of this book thinking I could write anything I wanted about these animals, talk to anybody I wanted to, and create any narrative that I wanted, and I could make it clear that you could move all in this story. And then I finished the book, and I went to a bookstore event. The book wasn't out yet, and I was there for another book. And afterwards, the bookstore manager asked me what I was working on now, and I said, I'm working on a book called Coyote Settles the South. And a hand went up in the back right away, and this woman stood up, and she said, "You're not pro-coyote, are you?" And I was thinking about it, and I said, well, I wouldn't say I'm pro-coyote. I would say that I'm pro-biodiversity. And I hope that there's going to be a majority of animals in the landscape and a number of animals. And she said, well, I just, if you're pro-coyote, then I've got to get up and leave, because in my gated community, the coyotes have been eating our cats, and we hired a trapper for $2,500, and he came in and trapped 5 of them, and they're still eating our cats. And so I can't be here with you if you're pro-coyote. So it really occurred to me, it really became clear to me that it was it's going to be harder to write about coyotes and present coyotes. I wanted to ask you just a final thing, one question. What's the worst response you've had to your book from a coyote hater?
Well, they're easy to find because you can go on Amazon and look at the reviews. And about every 6th or 7th review, there is one that is a 1-star review, and somebody says something like, if I could give this 0 stars, I would. This book is nothing but a bunch of drivel. This is tripe. That's one of the words that gets used, and evidently that's a word amongst people who don't like coyotes. This book is nothing but tripe. This is a bunch of bull. And so what people seem to be responding to is the fact that, and I say this right at the very beginning of Coyote America, coyotes are a political issue in America. They're yet one more issue that we have somehow found to disagree vehemently on. And so on one side of the debate are people who, as I think you said a minute ago, all they want to know from a coyote book is tell me new ways to exterminate them, and I'll read your book. If that's not what you say, then it sort of drives them out of their minds. And of course, trolling on the internet is a big deal these days, and people will absolutely say the most extraordinary things in something like the review of a book about an animal that you can possibly imagine. On the other side of the ledger, there are, especially in the American West, where we've been living with coyotes forever, there are millions of people who absolutely adore these animals. I mean, they watch them, they keep records. Every time I go to a book event in the West, I have people come up with their laptops and with their cell phones and show me photographs they've shot of coyotes in the yard and a family raising a litter of pups in the flower garden. And so it's yet another one of those things that we are just almost violently divided about in modern America. I mean, we've got a whole list of them these days, and coyotes are added to that list.
Yeah. Peter?
On that note, let's open it up for any questions anyone has. If you have anything, then come right up to the microphone and have your question, comment, diatribe.
She's got one.
Thank you so much for doing this. Enjoyed it. So I was just wondering if you think that your call to learn how to cohabitate with coyotes or settle with them, is it also an invitation for us to include other animals that we ought to settle with and cohabit? And I'm thinking about raccoons, right? Or do you think that this is your call, your invitation for this kind of cohabitation is unique to coyotes? Or is it really ultimately a way to expand our community to include other animals like raccoons?
I would say yes, it's a call, but it's a hard call. I mean, it's a difficult call every day. I keep looking down at my leather shoes here, and you know, some cow died for these shoes. I know that, and my friend Mike Willis made that point to me once about, you know, you're wearing a leather belt, John. You know, you got to come to terms at some point with things die, and you know, you take responsibility for these things. But raccoons are a really interesting issue because I think they might be as smart as coyotes. I mean, there's this remarkable documentary called Raccoon Nation about how raccoons are evolving in cities because of the challenges of living in urban areas compared to around wetlands. And I think that we're called to look at that coexistence issue with every animal, and to come to terms with, if we're not vegetarians, come to terms with how our protein comes to us. If I don't hunt, but I have a friend who gives me venison, and it's the same venison that ate my hostas the spring before, and I sort of say, you know, I did not shoot you, mother deer, but I'm going to eat your flesh, and you ate my hostas, and it's this great cycle. And I'm not sure if that does it, but it's at least an attempt to come to terms with existence and coexistence.
Yeah, that's a great answer, I think. I guess I would say I think of coyotes as being a little bit special because we didn't wipe raccoons out, but we did extirpate the medium-sized canid predators from this landscape and every other landscape in North America. And I think one of the things the coyotes are doing is that they're occupying that old niche that used to be occupied in this part of the world by red wolves. And I think it's, you know, I've spent 22 years living in Montana, and I was there during the time of the reintroduction of gray wolves. And my reaction to that while I was there, and it was not a singular reaction because gray wolves, of course, were political in the same way coyotes were. There are plenty of people where I lived in Missoula, Montana, who were very much advocates for gray wolves. But we all, as we watched it happen in Yellowstone and in the northern Rockies around us, I think most people, except for the most diehard ranchers who thought they were losing their livestock industry to wolves, sort of thought that this was making the landscape a much healthier place ecologically than it had been for 75 years. And I think by occupying this red wolf niche in the southeast, and all across the country east of the Mississippi River, coyotes are doing the same thing. They're returning a kind of a healthier ecology. I mean, we shouldn't be in ecologies without a mid-sized predator, especially ecologies that had evolved for hundreds of thousands of years with those animals on the landscape. I mean, I don't know a huge amount about coyote predation on white-tailed deer. I learned more today listening to John's presentation this morning than I knew total sum when I came here. But I do know that all the animals in the West that have the prey animals that co-evolve with coyotes, I mean, that relationship is tens of thousands of years old. Pronghorn antelope have 2 fawns every year with the idea that coyotes are going to get one of them. And so you have an heir and a spare. And the spare is the one that you assume the coyotes are going to get. I mean, and they long ago evolved this adaptation to be able to function quite well and to keep their numbers up, even in the face of coyote predation. And so I mean, this is how North America has, this is an old place. I kind of end my book actually by saying that. North America is an old place. We kind of arrived here 500 years ago with the idea, you know, this place needs some proper weeding. We need to weed out a few things.
And what's worse, we think we own the place.
And we think we own the place. I think that kind of was an act of hubris, though. So, anyway.
I don't know if I get to add a comment, but an angle on Nancy's question that I think is worth considering is that we're an urban species, especially in the industrialized world, and a lot of the animals that we're talking about just now are urban animals that we experience them in the landscape because they have throve with in cities and with people. So raccoons, possums, skunks, red foxes in Europe, coyotes, swallows, starlings, sparrows. Those are the species that are thriving in the world that we've made, and so we're part of that new ecosystem. We just don't understand it yet, I think.
Two additional guests in sort of recognition. Former President Joe Hussein, who was very instrumental in the founding of environmental studies and very supportive through the years of evolution. Joe, thank you so much for coming. It's good to see you. Ben Gregg, Executive Director of the South Carolina Wildlife. Ben and I grew up in Lockett Park in Florence all those years ago. His father taught me to throw a ball, and I ended up coming to Walford because I had some decent SATs and could throw football. So Ben's been very supportive of Walford, and I thought before this is over, maybe he would comment on the difficulty of getting the legislators, because they have to lobby on these issues to the legislature. And if you think it's difficult to convince your friends or neighbors or each other, perhaps before this is over tonight, he can comment on the difficulty in trying to lobby the legislators on some of these issues. So before this is over tonight, perhaps.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to say earlier that I didn't was in the entire time that I was working on my book, and I think Dan had the same experience, I never met a biologist who didn't understand everything we're talking about. And I never met a politician or a director of some wildlife organization that didn't see it as sort of a political issue that they need to fall one way or another, but they didn't always follow the biology. And I think both of us really have an admiration for biologists and for the research they do in these issues.
Well, speaking of biodiversity, and I'm not a biologist, but it's my impression that the deer population is ever growing. I've got a deer prominent den on the front of my car that's a testimony to that. And it would seem to me that with the extension of coyotes into areas in which there's deer, in some cases of population, I would think it would have a balancing effect, which would be positive. My question is, have there been studies of the balancing between, say, deer or coyote or other types of creatures like that?
Well, we made a joke before we walked in tonight that we were going to get a question And we were going to say, John Kilgo's going to have to answer this question because John Kilgo, sitting in the audience, biologist John Kilgo, has done much of the work, the research on coyotes in the South, and particularly coyotes and deer predation. And John, you can correct me. I'm going to try to answer that. But the idea that the deer population, I'm just talking about in South Carolina, is constantly going up is untrue. The deer population peaked at about 1996 at 1,000,002 animals. And since 1996, it's now fallen to 800,000 animals. So the deer herd has fallen that much. And the coyote population has headed directly up at the same time. And there's no doubt that coyotes are making an impact on the South Carolina deer population. Now, if the deer eating your hostas, you feel different about that 800,000 number than if you're a deer hunter sitting in a stand in Seneca, South Carolina, to fill your freezer with venison for the year, and you're not seeing as many deer as you did in 1996. So it is complicated. There are simple answers about balance of nature and all these things, but the real story on the ground is much more complicated than that. Dan?
Well, I'll use an example from the West, from Montana, which I just moved away from 2 years ago. I think what happened in Montana in terms of hunters and the game animals that they went after was that because American policy was to eradicate predators in the early 20th century, that most state game agencies conceived the idea of human sport hunting as playing the role of the missing predators. And so from about 1910 until 2000, a period of almost a century, in Montana at least, everybody got used to elk populations, mule deer populations, pronghorn populations that had no predators. And when gray wolves were reintroduced, the Fish and Wildlife Service, under the Endangered Species Act, reintroduced gray wolves into the northern Rockies in 1995, and those animals did extremely well. Within 15 years, we had 1,700 wolves in the northern Rockies. Hunting groups in Montana immediately began to argue that the reason it's not so easy to kill a mule deer or an elk anymore is because of the wolves. The wolves are the animals that have taken away our opportunity. I killed 3 elk in 3 years in a row from 2005 to 2008. Now I've gone 2 years and I haven't killed an elk. And so the wolves became the sort of scapegoat for difficulty in hunting. As somebody said this afternoon when we were going to have a beer before coming here, you know, hunters are always trying to come up with an excuse for why they didn't get a deer. And so it's become, I think, convenient to say, well, it's because of those damn coyotes. That's why we're not getting deer. Or in the northern Rockies, that's why we're not getting an elk. It's because of the wolves. Now, when scientists actually went out at the bequest of the hunting groups to study wolf predation in the northern Rockies, they discovered that actually it was probably mountain lions that were more responsible for a lowering of the elk herd than it was the wolves. But, I mean, it's just, what we're talking about is the kind of thing that used to be told in those old coyote stories. It's all about human nature. And human nature is to blame things on something else for their lack of success.
Yeah. Yes.
This is a question for Dan and John. I was curious if there was a piece of coyote folklore or mythology that you encountered while writing the book, or just personal studies that particularly resonated with you.
Folklore or mythology. This is folklore, I guess, but I was talking to this one guy up in, I did a chapter on fox hunting, old-time hilltop fox hunting, not tally-ho fox hunting, not the little hats and the red jackets. In the Old South, until suburbs, the return of the deer, and large 4-lane highways. There was a culture in almost every southern community where men mostly would go and sit around fires at night and turn their hound dogs loose and sit there and go, "There goes old Blue, I can hear him, I know what he sounds like," and they would run the foxes. They would hardly ever kill a fox. They would never have guns, and there was no alcohol involved. They'd just sit around the fires and listen to the dogs run the foxes. And all those folk songs come at it, like "A Fox on the Run" and all those things. So I went up and spent a night. I stayed out all night with one of the last old-time hilltop fox hunters and listened to the dogs run. And they told stories all night long about what they knew about coyotes and what they knew about foxes. And that night, one of the things I heard was that there was no research to this, but it's just one of the, a gray fox will only den where an old sawmill was, because they like to den in the sawdust, because the sawdust keeps them from getting mange. Yeah. And so that's why gray foxes have less mange than red foxes, because they always den in an old sawmill site. And I wrote that down, and I think I put it in the book. But I mean, there's a little bit of folklore. We don't have much mythology about coyotes in the Southeast. Dan's the one to answer the mythology question. What's your favorite little bit of either folklore or mythology?
Well, I mean, when it comes to coyotes, it's going to be hard for any of us to outdo J. Frank Dobie's book from 50 years ago, which is a book exquisitely and completely about coyote folklore, mostly in the Southwest, mostly in Texas, among the Mexican-American population there in particular. But, I mean, the subtitle of my book is, it's called Coyote America, A Natural and Supernatural History. And so, because I was doing the biography of the animal from its evolution up to its modern spread across North America, I mean, I had to devote a chapter, in fact, it's the first chapter, it's called Old Man America, to these stories from at least 35 different Western tribes, people who were found in the original range of the coyote, who regarded it as a major deity, responsible really for creating the landscape of North America and for serving as this avatar creature that basically, as I told somebody, one group, I guess it was your class earlier today, I mean, we think of these stories, if you know them, you think of them as trickster stories, but what I argue in this chapter, Old Man America, is that that kind of marginalizes these stories in a way, because it's not the trick that's the important part of the story, if there is one, and they don't all have a trick. But when there is a trick, it's not the trick that's important, it's why the trick works that's important. And the reason the trick works in these stories in every case is because the trick serves to illuminate human nature. So what these stories are really about is an explanation of who we are, why we react the way we do. And the coyote character, the original literary character from North America, basically functions as a character who tells people how not to act. So when Indian people sat around on winter evenings and listened to some really good Mark Twain-like storyteller tell these stories, what they were hearing is usually a very comical, very humorous story about why you shouldn't act this particular way. And Coyote functions as the character who's doing everything wrong. And what he usually is, frankly, is he's a narcissistic buffoon. And what everybody concludes at the end of the story is that, okay, acting like a complete selfish ass is not how I should be. That's not the sort of approach I should take to the world. And I retell, I mean, Barry Lopez did an entire book where he basically told about 30 of these stories in modern prose, and I sort of followed his lead by picking out 4 stories that I thought were kind of important ones in describing who this character was and what our human nature is. And so I retell in my own words 4 stories from 4 different tribes. in this chapter, Old Man America, to try to come to grips with what these 10,000-year-old stories in some cases tell us about who we are. And one of the things I did with it was to compare this take on human nature to what we know about human nature from modern neuroscience and from evolutionary psychology, and was struck in every case by how shrewdly these people thousands of years ago used Coyote to project these very same insights that we're coming up with from our science in the modern era.
I kept thinking about what I was learning at 12 years old in front of that television set every time that coyote ran off that cliff and survived. What was that telling me about my human nature?
Well, for one thing, it told you how to be a savvy consumer.
Yes.
Because you remember, the Acme Corporation? Yes.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
if I buy it from an American corporation, of course it's going to work. Well, of course, it never did work.
This is an interesting context. We talk about a lot of wildlife, we talk about hunters, and we talk about the wily coyote. It's very impressive. Just some comments, maybe to put a few things together. Man has certainly taken away a lot in wildlife. There is an effort, which I'm not quite sure how successful it is, but we had the cougar in Florida, and we're trying to bring the cougar back by creating corridors that go through the southeast. And in a way, it's going to be very beneficial to some degree because we have these very nuisance hogs, and they're ravaging the countryside, etc., with farms and landscapers. I hope some of the coyotes are preying on some of those hog piglets. And I think that hopefully the cougar, they come back and they'll be preying on some coyotes, and we'll start to get a balance. And the red wolf, they try to bring the red wolf back to a degree with a small population that had on Bull Island off the coast of South Carolina. I'm not quite sure where that is. But since you reintroduce the wolves to Montana and Yellowstone, I would just like for the audience to leave tonight thinking about the wolves. And the year of the deregulation that we're in, the wolves, I believe, are going to be under attack in Alaska because I think they're going to bring back into this regulation that we did this tracking the wolves and bears in Alaska. I think there's going to be an effort to deregulate that so the wolves can be trapped, the bears can be trapped, so they won't be predators to take the caribou because of the big sporting industry of caribou hunters. I grew up as a hunter, and I don't hunt anymore, but I have a great appreciation for hunting, but I just don't think that it actually stacked again in favor of hunting and the detriment of the wolves and the grizzlies. So I know I just thought, trying to blend that all together because it is a big picture that we're dealing with.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What?
Good evening, I'm Jim Gregg with the South Carolina Wildlife Federation, and talking about the sitting around with the fox hunters. I think this subject is one of the most fascinating of all the wildlife stories right now. And I was thinking about you sitting around the campfire. As long as you had Jim Dean there, I'd like to sit around the campfire all night and talk about coyotes, because I just don't think the subject ever gets boring. It's just it's an amazing story. I wanted to ask a question about the manifest destiny that I've always wondered about, because I know that there's evolutionary history here in the southeast and probably always eastern seaboard. But what I don't understand is there was a period, I don't know how long the period was, I guess maybe it was pre-colonial, and during colonial times, there was a period where the coyote was pretty much confined to the west, and maybe as far as Texas. And then the comeback, the manifest destiny began sometime in the 20th century, maybe 1920s, 30s, 40s. Why was that manifest destiny? How did that occur? What made that happen? Why did we go for 300 years or maybe even longer without coyotes in the east? And the other thing, Dr. Tyson and I did work together, and he's much more mature than I am, so. And I really appreciate him doing this tonight. But with the state legislature, I think George mentioned the state legislature and the really challenges we have with our state legislature. We have, and Dr. Lassane can attest to this, because he was one chairman of the Department of Natural Resources Board. We have the most powerful legislature in this state when it comes to our natural resources, because our legislature has not given hardly any power to the Department of Natural Resources to use biology. So our decisions were made on politics and on anecdotal discussions that our legislators have for the most part. And so it's a real challenge here in South Carolina, probably more than any other state, because the biologists are the ones that need to be calling shots here. And in our state, we have legislators and coyotes and a lot of things related to wildlife that are coming up against that are not going to work. So I have great admiration for the biologists in the room tonight, but unfortunately, they are not in the legislature. And last time I checked, we didn't have any wildlife biologists in the legislature, and I'm not sure that we ever have. So that's a real challenge in South Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you. The question, or the question of how the coyotes, why the coyotes are in the east, is a complicated one. We mentioned before that likely there was a coyote-like canid in the east in the Pleistocene, which was about 15,000 years ago. Through the Holocene, they don't have to have seen there. Now in the Anthropocene, the new period of geologic time, in the last 50 years, let's say, the coyotes have come from the west, across the Mississippi River, on the bridges, across the bridges, and they've come down from the north, mostly from the west. There doesn't seem to be as much of a migration from the north down, and they've colonized, settled the entire southeast. They were able to do that because there wasn't a mid-sized dog canid in the region. There was, for that whole period of the Holocene, the red wolf, and that we think kept the coyotes where they were. There was one other element to how the population grew. There were also dog pens, fox pens that were created in the southeast, and hunters who like to run their dogs actually brought in coyotes from out west, put them in these pens, chased them, and if a thunderstorm dropped an oak tree on a fence, 4 coyotes would get out, and they created populations. And as the coyotes were coming in from the west, they hooked up with these populations that are already here, and we have the situation we have now. There were other barriers Dan talks about in his book with why the coyotes were in one area and the wolves were in another, and so it's a complicated story. You want to add a little bit to that?
The only thing I would add is something I've mentioned already this evening. Is I'm firmly convinced that there's a pull factor.
I love your push-pull.
Yeah, which is the eradication of the wolves, and so that opens up the niche for coyotes to take. And your explanation, I think, in your book is the best one that I've seen anywhere about how these fox hunters wanted a new animal to pursue with their hounds. But I would argue, and I do argue in my book, that there's another factor that's playing a role, which is the attempt to harass, persecute, exterminate coyotes out west, because that has the effect of destroying their social lives and their social behavior, and it tends to split them off into the term that biologists use. And coyotes, we humans and coyotes are among the few mammals around the world that share this particular trait. It's called fission fusion, and the idea is that we're species that can exist as social animals and can do very well in the case of coyotes in packs or kinship groups. But in times of persecution, you can also scatter as dispersants, as individuals, as pairs. And I think the harassment for 70 years of coyotes in the West inclined them to disperse and colonize across the landscape. And the landscape they found open was the one east of the Mississippi River. And so I think it's a combination of those factors, and that totals up, I believe, 3 of them we enumerated.
Yeah. 2 very quick anecdotes. A friend, a poet from the West Coast, wrote me after my book came out, and she said that she'd been driving back from visiting relatives in 1963, and she was a Westerner, and she was crossing the Mississippi River on one of those bridges south of St. Louis, and in the middle of the night, and walking right toward her in the middle of the road was a coyote. And so they were crossing those bridges. And then with the fox dens, the fox pens, these were large fenced enclosures that people would bring in western coyotes and throw them in there and put the dogs in and chase them and bet on it and all this stuff. So I was talking to a guy down on the coast, and I said, "Do you know anything about these fox pens?" And he says, "Yeah, I grew up in Anderson, South Carolina." And he was a DNR guy. And I grew up in Anderson, South Carolina, and in the 70s I cut grass for a living, for the summer in those shopping centers along I-85. And this was in the 70s, early 70s. And he said, I was cutting grass one day, and I was pushing the mower past this big tractor trailer truck, and I heard all these dogs barking. And the guy was asleep. He just pulled off to take a nap in this shopping center. And so he woke up, and I was coming back by with a lawnmower, and I said, "Hey, what are you doing with all these dogs in the truck?" And the guy said, "Those aren't dogs, those are coyotes. I'm taking them to Georgia for those fox hunters. I got a whole truckload of coyotes back here." And that's just anecdotal, but if that one tractor trailer full of coyotes came into the South at one time, we wouldn't have this issue. But I've got a feeling there were a lot of coyotes that came across that river in trucks bound for Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, North Carolina fox pens. One more question.
Yeah, it's a little after 8:30. I think we can do one more, and then.
Thank you. I'd like to thank George Tyson and his family for doing this, particularly that. We didn't hike nearly as much as he said we did. And he was already been drunk when we did. But I really appreciate the discussion. I'm delighted to see I'm a 69 graduate of Walker. I'm delighted, 1969. Delighted to see that we have an environmental studies program. It's a wonderful thing. Dr. Lane, appreciate that. And Dr. Flores, who I know from the University of Montana, A.B. Hammond, professor of history for a number of years. I'm sorry to see him retire. But I wanted to say something, having lived through the wolf wars and going through, getting ready to start through the grizzly bear reintroduction. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be listed too soon, personally. One of the things that strikes me, we had to bring the wolf back. And we brought the wolf in. It wasn't just released at Yellowstone, it was released at Corn Creek down on the Salmon River. No connection as far as I know. Yeah, still researching that. But the grizzly bear is the same thing. I mean, it's almost extirpated. Famously, it survived in the national parks and it's doing fairly well, particularly up in the glacier area. But the coyote we didn't have to bring back. The coyote was there. And you touched on this when you talked about wild nature and when you mentioned Moby Dick and Ahab. Both of you discussed this a bit. But the people that are so opposed to the reintroduction, and there's a big lesson to be learned from the wolf wars, I think, there. But the people that are so opposed, no matter what, does it have something to do, and how do we get over this bridge, that's wild nature that we can't control? That we're not having to bring these animals back. We're not trapping them in Canada and bringing them down to Yellowstone to release them. The grizzly bears, we nurse them back literally, but we're not having to do that to the coyotes. And is that somehow, could you maybe give a riff on the symbolism of that as to our fear of that, and how do we get over that as a society if we are going to try to learn to live with creatures that are alive?
That's a great question, yeah. You know, I think my riff would be that the coyote kind of undermines our self-esteem. because with gray wolves, even with grizzly bears, we have the sense that we have to intervene on their behalf or they're not going to survive. The coyote, though, somehow seems to exist perfectly well, thank you, completely separate from all of our aspirations, all of our designs for it. And as Americans, that strikes at our hubris of who we are and how we control the world. Maybe that strikes at human hubris. Maybe this is a fit subject for a coyote, an old man coyote story, to illuminate something about human nature. But I think the coyote stands outside our own sense of how we manipulate the world. And that somehow seems disconcerting and unsettling to a lot of people. I mean, I will say, as a historian who I've spent years writing books and articles about the relationship between people and the natural world, almost every book I've written up until the moment I wrote Coyote America was about what we called in environmental history the declensionist story, which is you start the story and everything looks like the Garden of Eden. And by the time you get to the end of the story, it looks like a post-nuclear Holocaust. We've destroyed it all. But when I got a chance to write about coyotes, I had a chance to write about an animal that completely is counterintuitive to all of our sense of the direction that nature goes. And I found that a wonderfully exciting thing to do after writing so many things about how everything is going to hell in a handbasket. But I think for a lot of people, that's a little bit tough one to swallow, because what we're used to is the story of how everything goes to hell in a handbasket whenever we are involved with it. And this is one of those stories that seems to lie outside our ability to influence. And so I think we find it somehow strangely disconcerting.
Yeah.
What
Yeah,
would you say, John?
Very quickly just add that my experience writing this book gave me more hope than anything that I have encountered as an environmental writer. When I can say 100% that I have no fear that my great-great-great-great-grandchildren will not be able to see coyotes. They'll be here. They're going to survive. They're a creature that survives. And we do terrible things to them, and I'm not in favor of any of those, but they're going to be here. And as I wrote this book, I realized that I had hope, that I had wildlife hope in a way I maybe don't have for black bears or wolves or elephants. Maybe they'll survive, but maybe black bears of those have the best chance. But I have hope that coyotes are going to be around. It gave me hope as a writer.
Great thing.
Great. Well, John and Dan, thank you so much. George, thank you so much. And thank you all so much for coming out here and talking coyotes with us tonight. If anyone has time to hang around, then John and Dan and a few other people will be here if you want to keep talking about it. For everybody else, have a great evening.
Thank you.